Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Marilee Taylor, to discuss rail safety and conditions of work on the railroad. Thank you, Marilee. I'm happy that you're here.
Thank you.
Marilee has been working for 30 years as a locomotive engineer for Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad. She's a member of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, and she's a longtime member of the Railroad Workers United. I thought we'd start, Marilee, tell our viewers what it is like to be an engineer and working on the railroad.
Well, it literally is all the livelong day and all the livelong night for many of us. And ultimately our goal, of course, is to take the train from where we started and get it to our destination. That's what we do. We operate the train. I operate the engine, and every other engine operates in tandem, basically, with the lead engine. We monitor physically, keep an eye on everything around us. We monitor screens, 4 screens sometimes, to see what's going on with the train.
So there's screens following the length of the train. There's cameras that are...
No, there's no cameras. There's
Okay.
a PTC screen that does show you the track, so you can see the track. It's supposed to show you the signal indications, so you know, or you double check your signals. Very important, just like traffic lights. You don't want to miss a red one.
So they say
You got
green.
it.
Yes, okay.
Green go, yellow caution, red stop.
Yeah.
It's pretty much the same sort of thing. Take care of any slow tracks, slow the train down, stop it when we need to stop, start it back up. Monitor. During the actual motion, we spend a lot of time monitoring. We have rear view mirrors, which sounds funny, but they're side view mirrors, but we can see very well. And of course, we're always looking to see what's going on behind us in terms of the wheels. That is something that every engineer and conductor is.
But how far back can you see?
Depends on if it's dark or if it's light. It depends on how sharp a curve you're in. Tracks are not straight and they're not flat virtually anywhere.
Yeah.
So if you get a good curve, we know which curves are the best curves to see the furthest.
Because you've been on them before.
Behind, because we've been doing it for a while. Monitor that kind of stuff, and of course, it's a constant discussion in that cab of anything that would restrict our authority coming up, any we call it slack action, buff or draft forces is the official word. The trains there's a lot of slack in them, so that they move independently. They're not, each one doesn't have a traction motor to move the wheels. And so there's physical laws that occur, so we have to monitor that. How I run a train depends on what the train looks like, what it feels like, where the loads are, where the empties are. I get a map of that, or a little graph, but I could tell by the time I move the train, the rear of the train, I could tell you how it's built by how it feels.
How many women engineers are there? Maybe on just BNSF, but are there many women engineers? It's not a profession that you automatically think, oh, it's a woman engineer. So
no, there are not a lot of women. I was one of the first, at least in the South. I started in Atlanta, Georgia, and went from there. I was a brakeman. When I started, we had the brakeman classification, which was the helper to the conductor, basically. We had 2 brakemen on the train, and a conductor, and an engineer. And of course, I started out in the lowest position, which is a brakeman. And then I earned my conductor certificate, and then I earned my engineer certificate, which I've been doing pretty much ever since.
Well, I want to get to that question of crew, because you start as a brakeman, which I understand they don't have anymore, and signalmen and some others. But first, I'd like to talk a bit about the Railroad Workers United, what it is, why it exists, what is its relation to the other craft unions, because my understanding that there's a dozen or more unions that organize rail workers, but they're broken up by crafts like maintenance of way or engineers or others. So why is there another organization of railroad workers called Railroad Workers United?
Well, Railroad Workers United, RWU for short, is a coalition, a caucus, we call it a caucus, of union members or non-union members across all crafts who work in the industry. And we organize ourselves to push forward different struggles on the railroad. Of course, the fight for safety is always centered to that. The railroads talk a good game about how they promote safety, but in point of fact, who promotes safety is those of us who actually work on the rails are the biggest fighters for safety. And RWU, of course, along with that, has safety is a big concern of ours as well. We are divided into many different unions, 12 different ones based on craft. So RWU allows us to come all together, regardless of craft, regardless of whether or not we are even in a union position at any given point in time, to work together, to move our unions forward as well. Mm-hmm. Not a struggle in the abstract, but also through the unions. Many of us have been union officers, or some not, some have. I have in the past. And I think the stronger the unions are, the better off we are. But part of making them strong is making them reflect who we are.
Yeah, who actually is working.
We really are.
Yeah.
And if you look at any picture of the national leaderships of any of our unions, I can assure you we look far different in real life. We are of many of different nationalities, different languages, and of course, different genders. Yes. And we seek to unify ourselves in the same way Eugene V. Debs spoke about when he tried to organize the American Railroad.
All the railroad workers were in one union.
Right, because it's a false division.
Yeah.
What a worker does on the track affects me greatly as an engineer on the train.
And it would seem like if there's a contention between one of the craft unions and another, that interferes with a solution to the problem of safety. Like you're talking about the track, if there's a contract with the maintenance of way people and they are going to do A, B, or C, but it's going to threaten what the engineer or some other union can do, that's a conflict, which if you don't deal with it collectively, it would seem like it could create serious problems.
Well, the railroads attempt to use the different crafts as a wedge to keep us fighting each other instead of fighting the conditions under which we work, which affect all of us regardless of craft.
That leads me to want to talk to you about the derailment in Ohio at Palestine, and also I understand there was one just a couple weeks ago in Michigan, and there's been others. If I remember, the Federal Railroad Administration reports that there's 1,200 derailments every year. They don't all end up like Palestine, but if you were to kind of give a after-the-fact appraisal of what were some of the causes that led to the derailment, what would some of those you identify as?
The obvious one, which everybody is talking about on the news, of course, is the overheated bearing. The bearings on the wheels of train cars are not totally dissimilar than the ones on the front end of your car.
Right.
So what happened with that was that the bearing, they're sealed bearings. Again, sort of like your car. So if you found oil dripping around your bearing on the car, you probably wouldn't drive it for a long distance. You'd want to get it right into the shop. The same is true of rail cars. So this bearing, when it gets overheated because the lubrication is part of it, it's gone, and it seizes. It just like a car wheel. It seizes, and it wrenches the wheel off. We call it wrenching a journal where I come from, but we call it different things. So that's clearly what happened. It was totally preventable. It should have been picked up by the wayside detectors in the 60 miles prior to its derailment.
These detectors are not something that the engineer or conductor has any control over. These detectors are by some administrative office or somebody external to the actual train?
Yes, actually they're just a detector on the rail. It's a wayside detector, and it measures the heat of the wheel.
Okay.
So an increase in the heat of the wheel indicates that there's a problem with the car. It may not be the particular wheel. It might be a handbrake. Nobody it wasn't taken off fully. It could be many things. In this case, it was a bad wheel bearing. Could it have been seen? It wasn't seen. These detectors give an engineering conductor, the working crew, an audible signal. That is, I could, you have a defect, is pretty much it. And it generally gives you the axle count, which you of course, would inspect both sides further. And it didn't until it went over the detector as it was derailing. One of the reasons for that, and I want to make a point of it, is that hot box detectors, failed equipment detectors, it's the same thing, it's just different names for it, are not regulated, it turns out, by the government. So each railroad does what they call self-regulation, which on the railroad means no regulation.
And they would decide how hot it is. And
how hot it can be until the train, by law, should be
stopped.
stopped.
But if the railroad like Norfolk Southern had a degree that set too high, you'd just keep going. Even though you're getting a signal, the railroad wouldn't let you stop it because it hasn't violated their own self-regulation.
Exactly,
so to speak.
Exactly. Which are not objective, of course. They're based on making the most money and moving the most freight the fastest. So that the non-regulation is a big issue. Because of course it should be.
Yeah.
We all now know that 253, I forget what it was, 253 degrees above ambient or whatever it was, is too hot, which of course the railroad also knew. The railroads also have the capacity to instruct the crew, even with an audible alarm, to instruct the crew to continue anyway, where the usual thing we would do is stop. As soon as an engineer hears that sound, we try to choke down the speed, because your conductor, number one, is going to have to get off and get to walking. You want to be able to place the conductor in hopefully at like a crossing or something to let him off for better footing. Maybe pull by as much as you can of the trains.
Yeah.
There are trestles that are not walkable.
Yeah.
There are many things that you just can't get there. There's no sidewalks along the side of the most of the time there isn't even level ground.
But the railroad doesn't allow you to make this decision independent, even though you're trained to do it and you know the rules, you know the regulations. The railroad says you can't do this. You're going to keep going.
Well, they don't actually have a rule that says you can't stop. Those tussles are played out in real life.
Yeah.
For example, I've had instances where I've seen something isn't right. Either I'm seeing some smoke, I can't tell what it's from, or a spark maybe at night. And there's only one way to find out what the problem is, and that is for somebody to physically be there and look at it and see, is this safe to continue? Oftentimes they'll stop. Maybe I'll let them know I'm stopping, or maybe this train is challenging and all my concentration is going into what I call it a Cadillac stop. Nice. So I've had them get very angry. Well, why you stopped? Something ain't right back there. That's how I talk on the railroad. Something ain't right back there. Got sparks, got to check it out. And then there's, are you ready to move? Are you ready to move? Because there's a disconnect between the interests of the crew in making sure this is safe and the railroad's perceived need to keep it moving.
So when you talk about the interests of the crew and also the railroad keeping things moving, my understanding is, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago there were five-person crews, and now you're down to two. And even when you had five-person crews, the limit to the length of the train that was moving freight would be 80 cars. And I don't know what the one was in East Palestine. I think I read it was 150.
155 maybe?
Yeah, so that's, I mean, you've got almost twice as many cars with a crew that's only 40% of what it used to be. And
correct.
Inaccurate or non-functional screenings and warnings. It seems like, as you said, this could have been predicted, but it almost seems like it's part of the railroad operations. At least Norfolk Southern and BNSF and some of the other big railroads, they want you to keep moving because there's freight that has to get there. That's where they get their profits from. And the longer the train is, the more freight they can haul, the more they can charge, and the fewer staff people that are on the train, the less they have to pay to keep
Right.
it moving. So,
Well, what in the past roughly 10 years, I'd say, they've established a business model based on Wall Street hedge funds to extract the most profit out of every Class 1 railroad. There's 7. NS is one of them. BNSF is another. UP is a third. And the other big player, 2 big players, is NS, of course, and CSX. And then the Canadian National, or the Canadian Pacific
yeah,
has swallowed up many, many smaller railroads here south of the Canadian border. They operate also in Canada. So the trains have tripled in size in length in some cases, and certainly tripled in tonnage. So the train that derailed in East Palestine was, I believe, 18,000 tons. That's very heavy. And of course, it's twice as long. So what the railroads have been doing is basically combining trains, just putting them together.
yeah,
That way they only use 1 crew instead of 2 crews or 3 crews.
yeah.
And it's led to an exponential increase in threat, at least, of problems. They're harder to run. Your train is in 4 or 5 different geographical positions, actually, in terms of the train itself. There's constant in and out motion. They're very difficult to control because you really can't. They're usually underpowered. So it's a situation that is so ripe, it's smelling overripe for many more accidents of this nature. And I don't really call this East Palestine derailment an accident. It's a wreck, for sure.
Yeah.
It's a devastating event for the people, the workers and farmers of that area. But it wasn't accidental. This is totally preventable. Had this railroad at that given point in time done what was absolutely the correct thing to do, which was to stop and inspect the car at the first indication that it was overheating.
Additionally, it's carrying toxic waste. I mean,
Yes.
all of this stuff with the derailments, probably many of the derailments that happen we don't even hear about because the media doesn't report it.
There's no vinyl chloride involved.
Right, yes,
exactly.
but in this case, it was a toxic substance, and then the railroad, I guess, maybe the local authorities decided to burn it off, which means now you're polluting the air, you're polluting the water, you're polluting the land. I mean,
It's
people were
frightening that the
told to-
railroad got to make that decision.
Yes.
It's frightening to me because I've seen the results of many of their other decisions, and it's never in my mind been in the interest of anybody other than those who own the railroad.
I think you're right there. I've read just today, Burlington Northern and Santa Fe made $23 billion in
Routinely.
21. Union Pacific made 22. Norfolk Southern, the one we're talking about, made 11 billion. I don't know what they made last year, but this was 2 years ago. So it's like all of these, I mean, when you're talking about the failure of even the regulations that exist that are kind of self-regulations for each of the rail carriers, it's not, you're right, it's not an accident. It's almost, it's
a cost of doing business
yeah.
because actually they're going to make out far better than if they were forced to run their railroad, and along with the other 6 Class 1 railroads, if they were forced to run it in the best possible way, that is, make
for
sure
public safety.
For public safety, first and foremost, safety of the workers on the rails,
Yep.
secondly, or equal to, but they don't. It's all in the interest of the most money. It's a get-rich-quick scheme. You run the infrastructure into the ground. You don't put money into the maintenance because it's cheaper to fix a wreck, to clean up after a wreck,
Yep.
than it is to provide the maintenance to prevent the wreck.
Even if you get a fine, it's kind of like...
Exactly, and the fines, quite frankly, I have been involved in some incidents with the railroad where the FRA was involved and did fine the railroad, and come to find out there is some kind of provision where it can be bargained down to pennies on the dollar for the fine anyway.
No enforcement.
No enforcement.
Were these some of the issues that were in play last fall. There was the national media suddenly talked about rail strike's going to happen, rail strike's going to happen. Counseling Biden to get involved, counseling Congress to intervene. So were some of these issues part of the contract proposal to, not keep cutting the staff, not keep lengthening the trains or the weight of the trains, having some enforcement? And I also understand this question of whether or not you can be on call or whether or not you have the right to take a day off, even if you're taking a day off without pay. That seemed to be one of the sticking points, that I can't take a day off if I work for the railroad.
Right, that's concomitant with the slashing of the workforce by a third over the last 7 years or so. It's concomitant because if you have the same level of work and you slash the workforce,
they're going to have to
those
work.
who are left are
more.
still going to work.
Yeah.
They have to work more and harder. So along with cutting the workforce, they also piled an incredible amount of work on everybody else. And in order to accomplish that, they couldn't allow us to be human beings.
Yeah, you can't take a day off.
We could not take a day off.
Even if they're not paying you.
No, and we were never paid. We have never gotten sick leave.
Yeah.
In most unions, I think there are a couple that had, and they are getting a little more as the railroads are trying to get out of the public eye, which is all this is, get out of the public eye, give them a couple days of sick leave.
I noticed that recently the RWU has called for a plan to have public ownership of the railroads as a solution to safety, public interest, quality of life, the efficiency for moving goods.
We think it's the only answer.
So what does this mean exactly? What would public ownership of the railroads entail?
What would it look like? And first and foremost, I just want to say that we already know that the railroads themselves are not going to make the infrastructure or anything else better. Their entire trajectory is to suck every last cent of profit out of the operation. Nationalizing the rails would take that out of their hands. The railroads are an important national asset that we have that belong, in my opinion, to the American people. Those of us who live and work in this country, we should be expanding the railroads so that all shippers have access to rail. So that we can, I think we should talk about passenger trains.
Yeah.
All those things. So we have brought up now this question of public ownership, taking it out of the hands of the railroads. Now, there's a lot of
private company that functions just to get profits, without public interest or even public safty as part of their
it's not
concern.
Even on the horizon where these companies, where these railroads are concerned. It should be a resource that is meant for the benefit of all who live and work in this country, whether it's transportation by passenger rail or it's getting goods from one end or one corner of the country to the other. To do that requires not looking at profit as your motive.
But
it cannot be based on profit.
Serving the public.
But serving the need and strength, and of course that strengthens the economy of everyone and so on and so forth.
Just think the numbers I gave just a minute ago. If you're talking $70-80 billion that goes to private companies, which could be used for building infrastructure, having more trains, having crews that actually can take a day off now and then.
Exactly.
So.
And it's not really, I don't want to talk about so much how the profit just goes to these companies. I think quite clearly the profit goes to a certain set of individuals, regardless of which railroad it is.
Yes.
And it's not in my interest or in yours or in anybody who works in this country to continue to fill the pockets of whether it's Berkshire Hathaway or the CSX shareholders fill their pockets with gold. It's just the time for that is done. Yeah. We need to organize ourselves in a rational way that is human. Where when I explain, and we did vote to strike twice precisely over the question of being able to take more than 24 hours off in a 30-day period. All the rest, every other living breath was at the behest of the railroad.
Yep.
Only if they wanted you, you went.
Well, it would
You
seem
waited.
like public interest would solve some of those contractual problems and solve some of the conditions for rail workers. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. It went quickly. Thank you, Marilee Taylor, for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.